Water blasted from a nozzle, powerful enough to tear apart an entire hillside in minutes. This wasn't a flood, wasn't a natural disaster of any kind. Miners built this weapon on purpose, pointed it directly at mountains, and watched solid rock disappear. For 30 years, this technique reshaped huge sections of California. Then one court case shut it down almost overnight. Quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching from today? This started as one desperate miner's shortcut. It ended up reshaping entire mountain ranges. By the early 1850s, California's easy gold was disappearing fast. Thousands of prospectors had already panned the state's streambeds clean, scooping up loose gold flakes that had washed downstream over centuries. That surface-level gold, the kind requiring only a pan and patience, was running out. Richer deposits still existed, though. Ancient gravel beds buried deep within hillsides held substantial gold reserves, remnants of prehistoric rivers that had long since dried up or shifted course. Reaching this buried gold presented a genuine problem. Digging through solid hillsides by hand, using picks and shovels, proved painfully slow. Many claims simply weren't profitable enough to justify that level of manual labor. Miners needed something faster. Something capable of moving enormous quantities of rock and gravel without requiring years of exhausting hand excavation. Edward Matheson found an answer in 1853, working a claim near a site called Blue Tent in Nevada County. Rather than continuing to dig by hand, he tried something nobody had attempted at this scale before. Matheson rigged a rawhide hose, connecting it to a nozzle he'd carved himself from wood. Water flowing through this hose built up pressure, then shot forward with considerably more force than anyone expected from such crude equipment. He aimed this improvised device directly at a hillside, watching pressurized water tear away chunks of dirt and gravel far faster than any hand tool possibly could. Matheson realized he'd stumbled onto something genuinely revolutionary. This wasn't sophisticated engineering born from careful planning. Necessity drove this invention, a miner desperate for faster results, experimenting with whatever materials happened to be available. Word of Matheson's success spread quickly through California's mining communities. Other prospectors began experimenting with similar setups, refining the basic concept using whatever hoses and nozzles they could source or fashion themselves. Early versions remained relatively primitive. Canvas hoses eventually replaced rawhide, offering better durability under sustained pressure. Wooden nozzles gave way to iron, capable of withstanding forces that would have quickly destroyed Matheson's original hand-carved design. None of these early miners fully grasped what this technique would eventually become. What started as one man's practical solution to a specific claim's challenges would soon transform into something far larger, far more powerful, and ultimately far more destructive than anyone initially imagined. California's mining industry stood at a genuine turning point, though few recognized it yet. Matheson's crude wooden nozzle represented the earliest version of a technology that would soon reshape entire landscapes across the state. One crude wooden nozzle worked well enough to prove the idea. What came next turned it into something far more powerful. Hydraulic mining's basic principles stayed consistent, even as the technology evolved dramatically. Workers directed high-pressure water through specialized nozzles, eventually known throughout the industry as monitors. Aimed directly at hillsides, this pressurized stream tore loose enormous quantities of rock, gravel, and soil within minutes, work that would have taken hand laborers days or weeks to accomplish. Once dislodged, this material didn't just sit there. Workers channeled the resulting slurry, a thick mixture of water, mud, and gravel, through wooden sluices constructed specifically for gold recovery. Inside these sluices, mercury played a critical role in the process. This liquid metal bonded readily with tiny gold particles, forming an amalgam that miners could later separate and process to extract pure gold. The scale of this operation grew remarkably fast. Early monitors remained relatively modest devices, limited by canvas hoses and basic iron nozzles that couldn't withstand extreme pressure without failing. By the 1870s, though, monitor technology had advanced considerably. These devices now measured anywhere from 13 to 18 feet long, engineering marvels capable of blasting water streams up to 500 feet from their nozzle. Manufacturing companies began competing directly for market share, producing branded monitor models designed to outperform rival products. Names like Hoskins Dictator and Hoskins Little Giant advertised raw power, promising miners maximum destructive capability for their investment. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe. We cover engineering feats like this every week. Operating one of these massive monitors required genuine skill. Workers needed to control the nozzle's aim precisely, directing that tremendous water pressure exactly where it would prove most effective against a given hillside's geology. Get the angle wrong, and valuable water pressure simply wasted itself against unproductive rock sections. Position it correctly though, and an entire hillside could disappear within a matter of hours, tons of material washing away under sustained, concentrated pressure. This technology fundamentally changed what mining operations could accomplish. Claims that might have taken years to work through using traditional hand methods suddenly became economically viable projects, completable in a fraction of the time using these powerful new machines. Mining companies invested heavily in this equipment, recognizing genuine competitive advantage for operations capable of processing gravel faster and more efficiently than rivals still relying on older, slower extraction methods. What began as Edward Mattison's improvised wooden nozzle had transformed into sophisticated industrial machinery, purpose-built for reshaping landscapes at a scale nobody could have predicted just 2 decades earlier. These machines worked exactly as intended. What they did to the land around them was another story entirely. Witnessing hydraulic mining in full operation left a lasting impression on anyone who saw it firsthand. A visitor touring California's gold country in 1868, a journalist named Samuel Bowles struggled to find adequate words for what he'd witnessed. He suggested that combining a tornado, a flood, an earthquake, and a volcano together still wouldn't quite capture the scale of devastation these operations produced. That comparison wasn't hyperbole for effect. Entire hillsides genuinely disappeared under sustained water pressure, transformed from solid rock formations into churning mud within hours rather than years. Consider the cumulative scale across California's mining regions. Between the 1850s and 1880s, hydraulic operations processed more than 1.5 billion cubic yards of gold-bearing gravel throughout the northern Sierra Nevada. That number becomes almost impossible to fully visualize. Picture entire mountainsides, geological formations that had stood for millions of years, systematically dismantled by miners wielding nothing more sophisticated than pressurized water. The North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company operated the largest such enterprise anywhere in California. Today, this site survives as Malakoff Diggins State Historic Park, preserving physical evidence of just how dramatically this technique reshaped the surrounding landscape. Standing at Malakoff Diggins today, visitors can still see exposed cliff faces and eroded formations, direct evidence of hydraulic mining's raw destructive capability decades after operations ceased. This wasn't gentle, incremental erosion happening gradually over centuries through natural weathering processes. This was rapid, deliberate destruction, entire hillsides collapsing within timeframes measured in days rather than geological ages. Workers operating these monitors possessed genuine power that few other industries of this era could match. A team managing several large monitors could reshape more landscape in a single season than most natural erosion processes might accomplish across multiple human lifetimes. Mining companies celebrated this capability as pure technological triumph. Faster extraction meant more gold recovered, translating directly into greater profits for company shareholders and investors backing these increasingly ambitious operations. Nobody operating these monitors seemed particularly concerned about broader consequences beyond their immediate claim boundaries. The gold justified the method, at least from the perspective of mining companies focused primarily on extraction efficiency and profit margins. This narrow focus, though, ignored an obvious question nobody in the mining industry seemed eager to address directly. All that displaced rock, gravel, and mud had to end up somewhere once monitors finished tearing it loose from hillsides. Gravity provided the answer, whether mining companies wanted to acknowledge it or not. Displaced material flowed downhill, following natural drainage patterns directly into rivers and streams that countless communities depended upon for daily life. All that blasted rock and mud had to go somewhere. It went straight into the rivers people downstream depended on. Downstream from California's hydraulic mining operations, communities began noticing troubling changes throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Rivers that had once run relatively clear now carried thick sediment, a muddy debris minus called slickens. This material, washed loose from distant hillsides, traveled miles downstream before settling into riverbeds, farmland, and eventually entire towns. Mercury compounded this contamination problem significantly. Used extensively throughout the gold amalgamation process, this toxic metal frequently escaped mining operations, washing downstream alongside regular sediment and gradually poisoning waterways across the region. Estimates suggest hydraulic mining debris eventually affected roughly 6,000 kilometers of California's rivers and streams. That's an almost incomprehensible scale of contamination, stretching across countless communities that had nothing directly to do with mining operations happening far upstream. Flooding became a recurring nightmare for farmers working land near these affected rivers. Sediment accumulation raised riverbeds significantly over time, reducing their capacity to handle normal water flow, let alone seasonal flooding that agricultural communities had previously managed without serious incident. Fields that once produced reliable harvests now flooded regularly, sometimes burying valuable farmland under feet of mining debris within a single season. Years of careful agricultural development could vanish overnight when a swollen, sediment-choked river finally overflowed its banks. Fish populations suffered too, their spawning grounds smothered under layers of mining debris that hadn't existed before. Hydraulic operations began upstream. Communities depending partly on fishing for food or income watched local ecosystems collapse under contamination they hadn't caused and couldn't control. Tension between mining companies and downstream communities grew steadily throughout these years. Farmers watched their livelihoods destroyed by an industry operating miles away, seemingly indifferent to consequences unfolding far beyond their immediate mining claims. One rancher near Marysville, a man named Woodruff, experienced this destruction repeatedly across multiple growing seasons. Flooding buried his land under mining debris again and again, each incident representing genuine financial devastation for his agricultural operation. Complaints to mining companies accomplished little. Why would profitable operations voluntarily change practices that were working exactly as intended from their own narrow business perspective? Legal action started looking like the only realistic path forward for farmers and ranchers facing repeated, uncompensated destruction of their property. Simply asking mining companies to change course clearly wasn't producing meaningful results. Eventually, Woodruff decided he'd had enough. Rather than accepting continued losses without recourse, he chose to challenge one of California's largest hydraulic mining operations directly, setting in motion a legal battle that would eventually reshape the entire industry. Farmers couldn't outshout the mining companies, so Woodruff decided to take them to court instead. Woodruff's lawsuit targeted the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company directly, California's largest hydraulic mining operation and a significant contributor to downstream flooding problems throughout the region. This case, formerly known as Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company, didn't resolve quickly. Years passed as both sides presented extensive evidence, arguments, and testimony supporting their respective positions. Courts heard from numerous witnesses throughout this prolonged legal process. Farmers described repeated flooding and property destruction. Mining company representatives argued their operations remained entirely legal, simply utilizing available water resources exactly as countless other California mining operations had done for decades. Judges and legal representatives even visited affected areas directly, observing firsthand the physical damage mining debris had caused to farmland, waterways, and surrounding communities throughout the region. This wasn't a simple, straightforward case resolved through brief courtroom arguments. Mountains of testimony accumulated over years, documenting losses experienced by property owners like Woodruff, alongside legal rights that mining companies claimed protected their established operations. Finally, on January 7, 1884, Judge Lorenzo Sawyer delivered his verdict. Sawyer himself had originally come to California as a gold seeker decades earlier, giving him genuine first-hand understanding of both mining operations and the broader gold rush culture surrounding them. His written decision stretched beyond 200 pages, an extraordinarily thorough examination of evidence, arguments, and legal precedent relevant to this complex case. Sawyer's ruling carefully threaded a specific legal needle. Hydraulic mining itself wasn't illegal, he determined. Companies retained every right to continue extracting gold using this technique on their own property. What crossed the legal line, according to Sawyer's decision, was something more specific. Dumping resulting debris directly into rivers and streams violated the rights of downstream property owners who depended on those same waterways for agriculture, drinking water, and daily life. North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company could continue operating, Sawyer concluded, but only under significantly different conditions moving forward. The company would need to contain its mining debris, preventing it from simply washing downstream into rivers that countless communities relied upon. This distinction mattered enormously for the industry's future. Sawyer wasn't banning hydraulic mining outright. He was fundamentally changing the economics of operating this way, requiring companies to solve an expensive containment problem they'd previously ignored entirely. News of this decision spread quickly throughout affected communities downstream. In Marysville, one town that had suffered repeated flooding and property damage from upstream mining debris, church bells reportedly rang out jubilantly that same evening. Years of frustration, financial loss, and seemingly endless conflict with powerful mining interests had finally produced meaningful legal recognition of downstream communities' legitimate grievances. On paper, this was a narrow legal ruling about debris disposal. In practice, it ended an entire industry almost overnight. For 30 years, workers pointed rivers at mountains and won. Then a judge decided the rivers belonged to everyone downstream too. Hydraulic mining reshaped California twice, once by force, once by law. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more lost construction history.